So it should be visible right now, is it? So I'm glad that Oscar started this discussion this seminar, because he spoke about the deals between Italians, between Italians and Soviets, about the Soviet standpoint regarding the financing, the first oil deliveries, how difficult it was, and so when we see the Soviet Union at the beginning of this process, it's let's say end of the war, World War II, and the 1940s, 1950s are pretty much significant in the way how the economy works. So the Soviet economy is based on coal, peat, wood, and coal as the primary triggering point of industrial revolution is pretty much omnipotent in the Soviet economy. And only during the 1950s, especially in the end of the 1950s, and then gradually in the 1960s, the energetic infrastructure, especially the petroleum infrastructure, starts to widen up, to open up, especially in the European part of the Soviet Union, in the so-called Volga Basin, which was pretty close to the partners in Eastern Europe and eventually in Western Europe, like Italy, which was mentioned by Oscar. And we see that during the 1960s, slowly but gradually, the production of oil increases and the Soviet Union is able to start making bigger and bigger deliveries, not only to the East European partners, but also to West European economies. So now if we want to make a judgment about how strong oil was in the portfolio of export, we have to understand that in the times of the long economic development, the 30 years of steady economic growth, starting with the end of World War II and ending at the very end of the 1960s or beginning of the 1970s, the economies, both of the East and the West, needed more and more of energy input so they could help to manage all this economic and industrial growth happening in their countries. So the Soviet Union could use oil to foster its own economic but also political potential. Now, when we see what oil was used like in a, I'm sorry, I should have turned off my phone. So when you can see oil as an instrument of foreign trade in the Soviet Union, and you see it economically and politically, you could see that East European countries, which were part of the Comecon, they started to restructuralize their own economies and infrastructures based on the deliveries of oil from the Soviet Union. So this cheap oil was helping them to develop their heavy industries, metal industries, etc., especially countries like Czechoslovakia or East Germany, which were particularly poor on natural resources. So for them, it was extremely important. It sort of victimized their economies towards the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union would be able to use it as a leverage. At the same time, it victimized Soviets too, because they were obligated to help those smaller satellite countries in Eastern Europe. So that was already from the very beginning something which I would call a mixed blessing for both of the partners, Soviet Union and the socialist countries. Then we have the West European capitalist countries, which, as Oscar described, came into business with Soviet Union, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. During 1970s and the Titan epoch, you can see that the development of mutual business deals is really very fast. Italy was mentioned. You see West Germany, especially in my findings, that there are so many deals which were not only limited, of course, to oil, but to machinery industry, to all kinds of specific branches of industry which are stronghold of the German economy. And then, of course, you would have United States, which would be in the game for Soviet oil and especially for Soviet natural gas in the long 1970s. So even the United States, which was the biggest oil producer, then together with Venezuela, an exporter as well, and a country which would be ready in the 1970s to cooperate with Soviet Union in a deal regarding natural gas. So it's something which we see as a very important part of international relations and foreign policy of the Soviet Union during the 1970s, the long 1970s, let's say. And it's reaching so far that we can say that those elements which were already there in the 1970s, they became a counterpart of not only Soviet, but the Russian economy after 1991. And the oil industry and oil exports are extremely important as a stronghold of the Russian economic potential, even in 2020. Now, if we talk about those three groups, socialist, West European countries, and then the point of view of the United States, you can see that especially East Germany and Czechoslovakia were major recipients of Soviet oil among the East European countries. Of course, Romania was able to be self-sustainable regarding oil and was even a net exporter of oil until the 1970s. But East Germany and Czechoslovakia were the most developed industrial countries of Comecon. So they needed a lot of natural resources. They needed a lot of oil. And so these countries were probably the most vulnerable in case the Soviets would like to use oil as a leverage in some kind of negotiations. And when you see the numbers, in 1970, 85% of oil, which was required by the Comecon countries, was covered by the Soviet production. So of course, there were some other partners like Libya, for example, in different stages of the development. It was Iraq or Iran, which was used as a partner for oil deliveries, but those were only minor things. The biggest partner for the oil imports was always the Soviet Union. And there has been a lot of research done about the oil shocks, 1973, 1979. And I think that it's always very fascinating how much changed, not only for those West European countries with the peak of the prices in 1973, but also for the East European countries and for the Soviets who would have the chance to get all these petrodollars out of the cells with such great market prices in the whole world. So for the Soviets, when the year 1973 came, it was a chance to deliver more oil to the capitalist West, to be able to make more hard currency, to invest it back into consumer goods or some civic economy, some civic infrastructure. You can see that in the following 2 years after 1973, the Soviet Union, in order to increase the oil deliveries to the West, it cut back the deliveries to the East European partners. And in a very blunt way, many times, when the chairman of the State Planning Committee, Gerhard Schürer in East Germany, met with Prime Minister Kosygin, he told him, we have big problems to cover our 5-year plans with all the deliveries we need. We cannot afford to have less deliveries. You have to at least keep them on the same level like you did in the first year of the 5-year plan. And Kosygin answered to him like, well, in that case, Mr. Chairman, you just have to change your plan. And you can see that in many ways, the Soviets were extremely blunt and bold with their East European partners. regarding the pricing system, which was always very favorable to the East European partners, and was based on those 5 years, 5 years turnouts of the market prices, the so-called Bucharest system. This was changed in order to make the prices higher. And in 1975, you can see that instead of the earlier $28.4 dollars for 1 ton of oil, the East European partners had to pay more than $60. So this was an immense increase. And if you see the East European economies, they really faced this problem with growing intensity, resulting into the debt crisis and the decline of economic growth in the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. So for these countries, there was almost no exit strategy. If they wanted to support their industries, they had to find some secondary solutions. In the case of Poland, GDR, and Czechoslovakia, it was jumping on coal again. Not only the black, but also the very low quality brown coal with bad energetic results, but also bad environmental results for all these three countries and their environment, the nature, etc. So this was a long time effect, which was visible very long or for a very long time, deep into the 1990s, when the restructuralization of these economies was underway. So we see that changing the prices, changing the amount of deliveries to the East European partners would trigger a lot of problems for them and would also be used as a leverage. So that's about the East European or socialist countries. When we talk about the West, I will just put a couple of more things. What Oskar already said is pretty clear, that West Europeans were interested in making deals with the Soviet Union, increasingly during the 1960s, and 1973 was a turning point for these countries as well, because they found themselves to be the victims of Arab countries, Arab oil exporting countries. It started with 1969 in Libya and finished with 1973 with the energetic crisis. So the West Germans, the Italians, big European economies were interested in making deals with Soviet Union. We can see that some countries like the Great Britain was doing a different kind of approach, trying to get into its own possibilities to find more reserves, to drill in the North Sea and use its own British and Western partners companies. So it was basically West Germany, which seems to me like the biggest and most important partner in Western Europe for the Soviet Union. It was a strong economy with enough financial potential and enough potential in companies. When Oskar was talking about the comparison between Italy and West Germany, I agree that it was West Germany which had this potential of companies like Mannesmann or AEG and others, which would be able to provide the necessary pipelines, the necessary refinery equipment, etc. for the Soviet Union in order to make the infrastructure in the Soviet Union work. And so the Soviets would be able to deliver oil and later natural gas to West Germans. And we see that it really worked. I mean, in 1975, West Europe in general received 40 million tons. In 1980, it was already 64 million tons of oil. But at the same time, it seems to be like a big amount. But if you see the case of West Germany, then you see that even if the imports of the Soviet oil rose, the share of the oil's total consumption in West Germany was still less than 10%. So if there was some kind of political opposition against the collaboration with the Soviets and using Soviet oil, we can say for sure that the dependency or the political conditioning by the Soviets, like, okay, if you don't want to do that, we will cut those oil deliveries. It would not work because those 10% would not make a big leverage possible for the Soviets in the case of West Germans. And this is the West European case. But when we see the Soviets, East Europeans, and then West Europeans, we have to include the American point of view. So how the American faced the Soviets and the development of the Soviet oil industry, how they saw the Soviets making business with not only East Europeans but West Europeans, whether they saw it as a danger. That's the reason why I asked the question to Oscar, because I saw that in the West German papers that the Americans were extremely cautious and always asking West Germans not to go deeper in business with the Soviets. And we see that it makes sense because the American specialists, they underestimated the possibilities of the oil industry in the Soviet Union. And the CIA even predicted that by 1980, Soviet Union would reach the peak levels of the oil production. And then in the next decade, it would only be less and less. It would significantly drop, and Soviet Union would turn into an importer of oil. But that did not happen eventually. And thanks to those big investments in the Soviet infrastructure, also with the help of West Germans and other West European companies, the Soviets were able indeed to increase their production. And we see that it was basically a big competitor on the world market for the American oil. If American oil companies wanted to export, they saw this cheaper Soviet oil as a big competitor, as a big competition fact. And when the Americans saw the West Germans and their very, very positive approach regarding the cooperation with the Soviet Union, they were very angered. But when there was a interview done with Helmut Schmidt in 1982 for New York Times, and he was asked why is this cooperation so important for you? Like, you should drop it in the interest of the solidarity of the North Atlantic Alliance countries and the solidarity with the United States. And you can see in the presentation what was the answer of Helmut Schmidt. It was pretty clear and pretty blunt what he said. You have not given us a single gallon of oil, and you can't do it, or of gas. You cannot do it. So we have to diversify our possibilities in order to make our economy stable or growing. The other problem which I would like to mention is that what you see in 2020, you saw back in the 1970s, like each administration, those 4 years or 8 years eventually, if they were re-elected, you would have big shifts in the approach towards the oil issue, towards Soviet Union in general. And while you can see that the Nixon and Ford administrations, they were really strong on this idea of collaboration with the Soviet Union, making it economically working for both of these superpowers, Soviet Union and United States, in the ambient of détente. Carter administration was extremely criticizing it, even made a ban on grain deliveries to Soviet Union. So something which was here mentioned earlier, the grain problem. And we have to include all those bans on and sanctions on technological imports to Soviet Union. So it disabled American companies or excluded American companies from the possibility to participate in those business deals in the infrastructure creation of the Soviet oil industry. That's the reason why West European companies could jump in. So this is a very important thing, always to see what was the American point of view. Now, they were, of course, Other problems included, which would regard the interference in the internal matters of the Soviet Union, when in the 1970s, the pretty much anti-Soviet American Congress passed the so-called Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which allowed immigration from the Soviet Union, especially the Jewish immigration, which was really an angering point for the Soviets. They halted the already existing trade agreement and made some already in talk being deals impossible. Probably the most known one was the North Star program, which included the idea of shipping the liquid form of natural gas by tankers from Murmansk to the United States. And this eventually never happened. Other programs or other projects which would make it possible to do some projects of the United States, Japan, and Soviet Union in Sakhalin would be also disabled because of this very, very negative American political approach. If we see what was happening in this time of the long 1970s, we will see definitely that there is a mixed blessing of both oil and natural gas. When speaking about the end of the 1970s and beginning of the 1980s, like the very last years of the Brezhnev rule, we see the increase of spending in both defense and energy. The Brezhnev elite saw big potential in oil, both oil and natural gas, because of the hard currency. But at the same time, it didn't have means left for increasing the power or increasing the possibilities of the civic infrastructure and civic industries to support the living conditions of Soviet people. So especially the civilian machinery sector, the consumer sector was underfinanced. Now, the oil investment grew rapidly, just with a short break during the Andropov years in 83 and 84. And it really paid back after 1979 because of the second energetic crisis and high prices of oil. But it would backfire in 1985 when the prices of oil started to drop rapidly and prevailed on low prices or low levels during the rest of the 1980s and even in the 1990s. So we can see that they significantly added a burden to the Soviet/Russian economy in the 1980s, 1990s, and resulted into the structural crisis of the economy. And there is no wonder that after 2000, 2001, the Russian economy started to revitalize very rapidly, because still, even after so many years, the Russian economy is based on the export of natural resources, and oil is one of the basic strongholds of the Russian economy even today. And we can see that the legacy of this oil policy of Soviet Union towards both East European countries, Western Europe, and in a entanglement with the United States, even in 2020, it plays a role. Whether you have oil and natural deliveries to partners in Russia, Kazakhstan, or you have Belarus, Kazakhstan, or the problematic issue with the Ukraine. If you have deliveries to countries like Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, or you have some big deals about drilling with American companies in Siberia. So the legacy of the 1970s is visible even now. I would like to finish my talk right here, tried to do some kind of overview, as you can see, and maybe you will want to contradict to what I said, or you would like to go deeper, and I'm pretty eager to discuss it further. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Thank you very much. Please, if we have question, I think we have question. Hey, Oscar, you're welcome.
Hi, thank you, Pavel, for that. A quick question. At the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about the Eastern European reaction to the rising prices. The Soviets come in and they say, well, now we're going to give you your price. They change the procedure through which they decide prices, etc. So that two questions. You mentioned that the Soviets had that they applied political pressure, or they could apply, or that they apply political pressure on Eastern Europe through their energy exports. Is there I was wondering what instance you were referring to. I don't know about Eastern Europe. With respect to Western Europe, of course, that just doesn't. I mean, it's not even on the table. But the question I'm really interested in is when the Eastern Europeans changed and moved back into coal. Have you seen any link between the increased use of coal and worker unrest? In other words, it seems to me like this would be an instance, first, of environmental degradation. This seems important because environmental what's the word? Protests regarding the environment were probably the most generative, at least for the Soviet Union. Whenever you see that in the Soviet Union, some protest was actually allowed, it was environmental in nature. So that's interesting. Partly they were protesting the environmental degradation. Partly they might have used it as a vehicle for other kinds of protests. But also, of course, in Poland and these places, you see Solidarność, you see the rise of unions. The tie between coal production and union unrest is very well established in the West, but it is a first half of the 20th century kind of story, although in late developing countries like Spain, for example, which I would know about, that unrest is there. In other words, the miners lead this unrest. Now, I'm sure that it's not exactly like that, but is there a link? Or do you see any links at all?
Pavel?
Thank you very much for the direction and those interesting questions. Now, I know what you mean, because it's really like it almost makes you think like there is some kind of shady way of doing politics, like by the Soviets with the East European partners. I would start making it in a positive way, or a positive vibe. In the Czechoslovak case, after suppressing the Prague Spring and the invasion of the Warsaw Pact, a new government was basically installed 1 year later, led by Gustav Husa. And in order to stabilize the economy and make the new leadership in Czechoslovakia popular, the Soviets promised to increase the oil deliveries. So this was used as a leverage in a positive way. And in the other way around, in East Germany, it was used in a negative way, because the Soviets found out that East Germans don't use all the oil. They refine it, do new, more expensive products, and then resell it to the West. So that was some kind of punishment in the East German case. So they could use it positively and use it negatively at the same time, I would say. Now, the issue of the increased coal production and the protests which were included, I think this is also an interesting problem, because East Germany was the last remaining country in the whole world which was still doing research on brown coal, because it was basically the only natural resource East Germany had left if there was no Soviet oil. But what I think is interesting is that they connected in East European countries like Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia the fact that they could at least use coal for themselves, And when they were in the debt crisis, they would resell the oil, as was the East German case earlier in the 1970s. And in all those cases, you would have environmental protests, of course. But in both East Germany and Czechoslovakia, when we are not talking about the unions in Poland, those environmental protests were pretty small, let's say, or they were, because they could not be really organized, they were very well covered by the state security. Both in East Germany and Czechoslovakia, they started to play a role only in the very end of the 1980s, because people were not that much afraid as they used to be in the beginning of the 1980s. You could see the gradual change in the people's feelings when they saw what was happening in the Soviet Union, and they tried to enact this civic force in their own countries. In the first attempts only in smaller groups, but in 88, 89, you could see that they would be able to organize a little bit better. And then eventually these movements, environmental movements, participated in the anti-communist demonstrations, both in East Germany and Czechoslovakia. So I think this is a very big part of the coal industry problem, that it triggered environmental issues. But in the long 1970s, they were not really a problem for the political elites. They were becoming a problem only in the very end of the 1980s, I would say. Thanks.